Do you address the nodes of the moon differently in a young person's chart, in a different way than you would someone who's, say, midlife or beyond?
It's an interesting question. The simplest answer, the really root answer, would be no. You know, they remain the same throughout the life. The issues remain the same. And going further, I've met very young people who I viewed as quite evolved, and older people who less so. The age of the body and the age of the soul, so to speak, should not be confused with each other. A corollary of that is there may be a relatively young person who's already doing fairly advanced work in terms of moving towards the North Node, and there are plenty of old folks who are still acting out their South Node and angry at everybody else for that. It's usually the crowning hilarity in it. So essentially the issues remain the same, so we'd say it the same, but I would have some sensitivity to the fact that a person in midlife or beyond has almost undoubtedly lived out the South Node pattern, so they'll know what I'm talking about. They've kind of been there, and it will have verisimilitude for them. Whereas with a young person, with the nodes and really everything in the chart, they haven't yet experienced it much. I occasionally find myself doing readings for very young people. Generally, my arm has been twisted fairly severely before that happens. Yeah, I'm talking about somebody who's like 12 years old. And I've had some actually pretty touching, great experiences doing readings for kids of that age, but not too often. Mostly, I really prefer somebody to be in their 20s. A way to say it really more effective than putting a number on it is I would like somebody to have already been brought to their knees once or twice by life, and then they're going to understand what I'm talking about in the reading a lot better. So in the 20s, solidly, a bright, motivated 16-year-old, you know, will be welcome if they really want the reading. Anybody under than that, unless there's severe arm twisting, I generally prefer to do the reading for the parents and talk about the spiritual care and feeding of the young person. And I generally put a line in there about how I have a hope and a fantasy that at some point 20 years down the road, the young person will find these CDs and dust them off and listen at the perfect time.
Can you tell me the meaning of the point of fortune?
The part of fortune.
Yeah,
yes.
the part of fortune.
Yes, yeah, I'd be delighted to. There's first some complications about the part of fortune. When I was a younger astrologer, learning about it in Dane Rudhyar's work, I think he wrote about it first in the Lunation Cycle. I believe that was the title of the book where he first described it. He gave a formula, which I'll soon be clear about, for the calculation of it. It has since come to light that the part of fortune was calculated historically differently for people who were born at night than it was people who were born during the day. And so currently there's some argument, like essentially the formula Rudhyar gave was the daytime formula for the part of fortune, and it really annoys the traditional astrologers. I don't take the argument too seriously for reasons I'll soon demonstrate. Now there's a sort of mathematical formula for calculating the part of fortune. I want to put that aside and just kind of show it to you more visually, because if we understand it, forget the math, but actually visualize it, it's going to lead us directly to an understanding of what it means and how to understand the application of it. Now, what I'm going to talk about here is the classic daytime formula for the part of fortune, as Rudhyar described it. We start out by observing that the sun and the moon will exist at a certain angle relative to each other in everybody's chart, which is to say, if you're born at the full moon exactly, the moon will be 180 degrees away from the sun. If you're born at the first quarter, it'll be 90 degrees ahead of the sun. So everybody has a sun-moon angle. It could be 162 degrees or, you know, some very specific angle. Now, here's the key. You preserve that angle, maintain that, and then you rotate the sun until it would be conjunct the ascendant, still preserving the angle. So if you visualize doing that, rotating the sun to the ascendant and preserving the sun-moon angle, you can see that the sun rotates around the dial too, or pardon me, the moon rotates around the dial too. Everybody tracking me? Okay, so where is the moon? When you have rotated the sun to the ascendant, where would the moon be if you preserved the angle? That's the part of fortune. Okay, that's what underlies the calculation. There's, you know, add the sun, subtract the ascendant, or there's some kind of formula like that. Forget about it. It's better to do it visually. And as soon as you've gone through that reasoning, you can begin to understand very simply and elegantly what the part of fortune means. So we work with the basic symbolism. The ascendant, kind of what you look like, what you're expressing into the world. That self-actualization idea that I've been talking about all through this weekend. The sun, it's like your essence, the core of what you are. So you ask yourself the question, if my essence and my expression, my sun and my ascendant, were perfectly aligned, if there were no difference between what I am inside and what I looked like. In other words, I am efficiently, honestly, directly engaged with self-expression, nothing intervening. What would that feel like? Okay, see, where would the moon be? What would that feel like if the sun were on the ascendant? Now, we already kind of know it would feel good, but what would it feel like more precisely and exactly? So we can sort of answer that question by where the moon would be, or now where the part of fortune is, to say the same thing. But then we can take that and make it more dynamic, not just what would it feel like, but what kind of attitudes and emotions and mood should I cultivate in myself in order to support the creation of that efficient expression into the world. And that, to me, is the deep meaning of the part of fortune. It speaks of a kind of integration of sun and ascendant and gives you some guidance for getting there. Now, in the, I don't want to go too far into this because I've not had a lot of experience with it, frankly. I just know about it technically. In the nighttime calculation, they would do the same thing except preserving moving the moon to the ascendant, preserving the sun-moon angle, moving the moon to the ascendant, and where would the sun be? It's like in one case we're emphasizing the moon in the nighttime and saying what would the sun look like, in the other, you know, it's reversed. So the whole night-day distinction was very, very significant to the ancient astrologers. Saturn above the horizon, or Saturn born in a nighttime chart versus Saturn born in a daytime chart would have different meanings. I don't know too much about that. I just know that that was part of how they thought. I don't use those techniques myself. I've not found them particularly helpful. But the part of fortune arose in that kind of context of astrological culture. Okay. You're welcome.
Could you talk a bit about the out-of-bounds moon?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. The out-of-bounds moon, I've discovered the out-of-bounds moon fairly recently, and in writing my most recent book, The Book of the Moon. I'd been kind of aware of it, and I began to poke around with it, and was quickly shocked at how extraordinarily powerful the out-of-bounds moon is. There's some deeply technical stuff that needs to be understood to grasp what the out-of-bounds moon means precisely. I actually would like to go through that with you, but I would like to begin by talking about how I've come to actually present this to a client who doesn't need an astronomy lesson in the midst of a reading. It's been challenging to figure out how to say it, but here's how I'll say it simply to a client. I'll say, all the planets, follow more or less the same course through the sky. We call it the zodiac. But in fact, they're not right on it. They'll rise a little above it or a little below it. The sun follows it exactly. Everything else is off a little bit. Sometimes planets get really far off it. The moon can get particularly high or low relative to that. When it's really high or low, we might call it out of bounds. Now that's an exceedingly approximate way of saying it. There would be people who knew astronomy who would be hitting the ceiling that I put it like that, because I have just related the out of bounds moon to the moon's elevation above or below the ecliptic. But in fact, it is its elevation above or below the celestial equator that determines its declination. But I don't want to bother a client with that kind of explanation. We take the Earth's equator and we project it out onto the celestial sphere. There's the celestial equator. We take the ecliptic, project it out onto the celestial sphere, about 23 degrees tilted relative to the celestial equator. As I mentioned earlier, the moon's orbit tilted another 5 degrees. So we've got planes that are not all laying flat with each other. We measure declination as how far above or below the celestial equator a planet might be. Now, on the Earth, we also have the tropics, and the tropics are 23 degrees, 28 minutes of latitude north or south of the equator, Cancer and Capricorn tropics. And when the moon, or really any planet, gets above 23 degrees, 28 minutes north or south of the celestial equator, which is to say in declination, it is said to be out of bounds. Now, those who have glassy eyes have my sympathy, but that is technically what's going on. Now, with that understood, we can begin to have some fun and understand what it actually means, what it symbolizes. So the sun cannot get higher or lower than those tropical lines. In fact, that's how the tropics are defined. The sun cannot be outside them. There's the extreme height and depth of the sun relative to the celestial equator. So the sun is the boss. The sun is the gravitational center of the solar system. Everything orbits the sun. Let's have a little fun with it for a minute. Imagine, the spirit of the planet Uranus, independent, doesn't want to obey the rules, would like to surprise you and shock you. And the sun says to the planet Uranus, approximately 5 billion years ago, sun said, "You will orbit me in an ellipse taking slightly under 84 years for all eternity. Deal with it." And Uranus said, "Do you know who you're talking to here? Give me a break. You think I'm going to obey your sneaking rules?" And the sun said, "Yes." And the sun won, because of the sun's gravity having utter and absolute dominion over the solar system, like it or not. So the sun emerging here as a kind of tyrant, absolute authority, but the sun only has its dominion within certain bounds, specifically between 23 degrees, 28 minutes north declination and the same figure south declination. And every now and then, the moon or other planets will get just outside of that. And it's like teenagers who know mom and dad are gone for the weekend. That's the spirit of it. Free at last, free at last. Independent, wild, thinking outside the box, no longer dominated by the external authority. I detail this, with a whole lot of information and examples in the Book of the Moon, but it can correlate positively with genius. The ability to look at what everybody else is looking at and see it totally differently. So we'll have, pluperfect illustration. Albert Einstein was born with an out-of-bounds moon. Sigmund Freud was born with an out-of-bounds moon. You know, this sense of total rethinking of everything. Louis Pasteur, you know, geniuses who have completely transformed our understanding of our place in the universe. When we look at it more darkly, it's those who break rules that maybe should not be broken. So we have criminals. Carlos the Jackal, you know, is a classic out-of-bounds moon kind of figure. When you read about the Nazis, you know, it's like a who's who of out-of-bounds moons. Now, Hitler didn't have one, but he was very close. Forgive me, the question is out of the blue, so my exact details are a little short, but if I'm remembering right, Hitler was within about a degree of having an out-of-bounds moon. Is very high. And I've actually come to realize that when planets get into fairly extreme declinations, they begin to operate somewhat like this. Carl Jung didn't have an out-of-bounds moon, but was very close. So I've come to actually have some question of just how seriously we should take this 20, 23 degrees, 28 minutes line. As things get close, they seem to work. But like Rudolf Hess, who was so crazy that the Nazis fired him, and if the Nazis think you're too crazy to work with, I mean, that says something, you know, wildly out-of-bounds moon. You get, zany kinds of characters, you know, harmless, but zany. In the world of music, Willie Nelson has an out-of-bounds moon. Tom Waits, you know, these sort of marginal characters that, you know, delight us, but, you know, you might not want to take them to dinner, you know. I don't know. Willie and Tom would be welcome as far as I'm concerned. But rule breakers, zany characters, people think outside the box. That's the real spirit of it. It's a bit like a Uranian or Aquarian kind of energy. I think of, here's a person with an out-of-bounds Aquarian moon, where we would expect, you know, pretty extreme expression of this principle. Cat Stevens, the rock star, pop star from the 1960s, who essentially walked away from it all to become a Muslim, you know, understanding the career implications of that, the sense of choosing to leave a position that others might view as enviable. That's an out-of-bounds moon kind of quality as well. Salman Rushdie has an out-of-bounds moon, you know, and he was, you know, of course, under the fatwa, you know, he was condemned essentially as an outsider relative to the Muslim faith. So we have a long list of rather compelling and extraordinary examples of this. It really works, and it's a very powerful signature. There's nothing subtle about it at all, and I would totally recommend contemplating the declination of the moon. You can learn a lot about it. Haven't really dealt with it too deeply this particular weekend because I'm wanting to deal with just the true rudiments, but it is arguably one of the true rudiments that needs to be integrated more deeply into our practice. So yeah, thank you.
I had one other question about that Uranus in the 8th house and in the evolutionary part. One of the things that makes me think of is mental illness. If whether or not that Saturn, Uranus, having to take care of somebody with a mental illness, is that within the realm of possibility for that 8th house?
Yeah, it's definitely within the realm of possibility. It echoes a comment that Tony put on the table just a little while ago, where he referred to the specific mental illness of obsessive compulsive disorder. And I was commenting that the contained tension of Uranus and Saturn in Gemini, you know, could correlate with OCD or really a variety of other conditions. I want to be a little careful here. Mental illness is, you know, of course, a tragedy and something that has to be taken seriously. I also want to say that there's a fair amount of cultural wash over the word mental illness. Like a friend of mine, a considerably older woman now in the South from a fairly aristocratic family, was actually hospitalized, psychiatric hospital, because she believed in astrology. This is a fact. Sad but true. And she's a woman about 80 or so now, not totally out of the ballpark of our own lives. And I mean, that ain't crazy. But, you know, recognized experts in the culture at the time all agreed she's mad. She believes in astrology, put her in the hospital. Maybe we can drug her enough to cure her, you know, of this disorder. So is anything that crazy going on in the world now, or have we all achieved enlightenment relative to, you know, what mental illness is and how it should be defined? Obviously, the answer is we're probably not all the way home yet as far as this goes. The reason I start out down this particular road is that all through history, a constant is that the truly Uranian people will be susceptible to being controlled by diagnosis, you know, that we will define them as insane or crazy or problematic somehow, and essentially render them neutral or pariah, you know, through such a diagnosis. So that with Uranus in the 8th house, we may be bonded with somebody who is defined in that way, who isn't crazy, but simply zany relative to the mainstream of the culture, is something we have to put on the table. Next to it, in a spirit of total sobriety, you could be hooked up with somebody who is just, use a clinical term here, batshit crazy. You know, I mean, that could happen too, you know? And so we have to consider that. And then even people whom we might view in sobriety as totally insane may, in some situations, have certain qualities of insight and genius about them. You know, they're not in a comfortable state, and they may be in a fairly dangerous state, but it doesn't completely neutralize them as a source of novel perspectives. And so there's a whole spectrum of possibilities in there that would fly under the general Uranian banner. Some of them just depressingly, you're crazy, and some of them a little more interesting. They could all fit. Yeah. It's just somebody who hears a different drummer. You can count on that.